Chowchilla, California, July 15, 1976. A school bus filled with 26 Dairyland Elementary summer school students, ranging from 5 years old to 14, is returning from a class trip to the Chowchilla Fairgrounds swimming pool. The driver, Ed Ray, a local rancher who drove the school bus part-time, casually converses with the children aboard the bus. The hot topic of the day was a petition, signed by 65 people, to extend summer school for 3 more weeks. With a hearty laugh, Ed bets some of the younger children the extension won't happen as he turns onto the very rural end of Avenue 21, which passes between endless grid squares of agricultural fields, when Ed suddenly notices a white 1971 Dodge van with its door open, blocking the road. Ed tries to weave around the empty van when a guy in overalls with pantyhose covering his face steps out into the roadway in front of the bus with a revolver. Ed stops the bus, and a man walks to the driver's side window and asks Ed, with no intimidation in his voice, "Would you open the door, please?" Ed opens the door. 2 more figures, dressed in an identical fashion, jump in, one with a rifle, which is quickly pointed at Ed. The men then usher Ed and the children to the back of the bus. The one without a rifle starts to drive the bus, and the one with a revolver hops in the van to follow them. They drive about a mile and park the bus in a bamboo thicket, where 12 kids are ushered into the white van. Ray and the other 14 kids get into the back of a second van, this one green. There's a partition between the driver's seat and the windows are sealed. Back in the quiet town of Chowchilla, parents are growing worried. Ed is always on time, never late. The entire town quickly becomes alive as its citizens utilize CB radios and every available vehicle to begin searching for the bus, the kids, and Ed. By 6:30 p.m., about 2.5 hours since anyone saw the children, the sheriff's department has a plane in the air. The townspeople begin driving through orchards with spotlights, looking for anything at all. Hours later, a Chowchilla police sergeant finds the bus empty, abandoned, and devoid of clues. Meanwhile, Ed and the kids are driven around in the burning hot dark for 11 hours with no pit stops, finally arriving at a rock quarry only 100 miles away in Livermore. After what seems like an eternity, the vans come to a halt. The back doors swing open. 2 guys are waiting. Ed is the first out, and one of the masked men asks for his name, while the other makes him take off his pants and boots. He's handed a flashlight and told to go down a hole with a ladder in it. Ed complies. The men continue taking names from the children as they exit the vans while recording their names on an old jack-in-the-box paper bag. The kids are stripped and sent to join Ed. The makeshift prison beyond the hole in the ground is a worn semi-truck cargo trailer which has been buried in the ground. The sides and ceiling are visibly warped from the weight of the surrounding dirt. Ed silently worries if the ceiling will cave in, or if they'll suffocate. He observes 2 makeshift air shafts constructed of flexible hose that run above ground. The trailer is outfitted with several old mattresses and an extremely negligible amount of necessities consisting of a loaf of bread, peanut butter, potato chips, and water jugs. There are holes carved for toilets. After all the kids are inside, a steel plate slides over the entrance, weighted down by 2 100-pound tractor batteries. The children beg to be let out. Some scream, to no avail. Much later in the night, Mayor Jim Dumas's wife gets a call from an anonymous woman stating, "The children will be found, but there will be others. It's not over." 100 miles away, 27 people are buried in the trailer, sweating, crying, and struggling to breathe. Despite the mysterious phone calls, the police have no idea why. There's no motive and no ransom note. The kidnappers forgot to deliver one. So who exactly were these kidnappers who forgot to deliver a ransom note for one of the largest mass abductions in U.S. history? Frederick Newhall Woods IV. His middle name comes from Henry Mayo Newhall, who traveled to California in 1850 with the miners to strike it rich, and did, in land and railroad speculation. He formed the Newhall Land and Farming Company, which his children incorporated in 1883. By 1976, the family was making $80 million a year in ranching, oil, and land, the modern-day equivalent of $370 million per year. It was Henry Newhall's land that became Santa Clarita and Valencia. The oldest community in the area, Newhall, is even named for him. Fred's dad, Frederick Newhall Woods III, resides in an opulent estate in the Bay Area town of Portola Valley called the Hawthorns, on a vast 79 acres. Fred IV lives in an apartment garage out back. Fred is a loner, academically unsuccessful, and directionless. He has a trust fund rumored to be worth over $100 million, but all he really cares about is cars, of which he owns north of 50 on his parents' estate, many of them junkers. The neighbors complain about how often they hear shotgun blasts from the property as, apparently, he enjoys shooting the windows out of his beloved vehicular prizes for kicks. Fred's life revolves entirely around buying, selling, and repairing old cars on his father's estate. It's a business he shares with his friend, James Schoenfeld, the son of a wealthy podiatrist. James and his brother Rick practically live with Fred. Fred has another business with a friend named Dave Boston. He's a filmmaking major at San Jose State. The pair started a partnership in 1972 called Townhouse Enterprises, with the grand plan that Fred will flip cars and use the proceeds to finance David's projects. They say they're going to be producers. In a letter to David, Fred writes that he has an idea, and he thinks this idea would make a good movie. This idea comes after Fred sees the film Dirty Harry and decides he wants to dream up a heist of his own. Fred begins dangerously brainstorming his big idea with James and Rick, and there, on his father's estate, the Chowchilla kidnapping is born. Fred figures, with Townhouse Enterprises, if he comes up with a good enough heist, he'll hit it doubly big. After the first payday, he'll get another one as a film producer. The Schoenfelds start to think he's onto something and begin to buy in as they assign roles to each other. Fred, of course, is the leader. James, constantly writing in notebooks and keeping a coded diary, is the planner. Rick falls in as subordinate to Fred and James, expected to do anything asked of him. The crew wants money, but not just any money, government money. In 1974, Governor Ronald Reagan had announced a $5 billion budget surplus in California, which the crew would later admit led to the logical conclusion that the state had more than it needs, so who would miss a mere $5 million, and how could they get their piece of the pie? The crew decided they'd need multiple victims for multiple millions, and said victims would need to be children because people will do anything for children. It had to be a school, because keeping kids safe at school is a governmental responsibility. They'd pay the ransom, no problem. The state pays the ransom, all their troubles are solved, and they let the victims go. The crew's logical conclusion is, everyone wins. So, why are 3 children of untold wealth and privilege planning one of the largest abductions in U.S. history solely for monetary gain? The fact is, these guys weren't flush with cash because they were in debt from parental loans from their largely failing business ventures. They wanted the windfall to gain respect from their parental financiers. And Ferraris. They had nice cars, but they wanted Ferraris. Per James's planning, they needed a bus, a plane, and a total of 3 vans. 1 van to get Fred and Rick to Chowchilla for the hijacking, and 2 more at hidden locations to transport the kids from the bus to the quarry. Over the fall of 1975, Fred, James, and Rick became committed to their plan and began taking inventory of what they'd need. They already had plenty of guns, that wasn't a problem. They buy 3 surplus Shore Patrol vans in Alameda and move them to a warehouse in San Jose. They go to Fred's father's quarry and bury a semi-truck trailer. Cutting holes for vents and toilets, they reinforce the ceiling with lumber so it won't collapse after it's buried. By December, they're ready to go. In what was quite possibly the only passable stroke of genius in the crew's plan, they decide the $5 million ransom will get delivered to a drop site in the Santa Cruz Mountains. They plan to drive up the coast to someplace heavily wooded, go back inland, and have airplanes patrol for 200 miles up and down the area until they saw a certain series of lights indicating the drop site. Then, the money was to be dropped on them, and then they'd be gone. By the time they had the money, nobody would be able to get there. You just can't stake out 200 square miles. The crew buys an X-ray machine from a Navy surplus disposal station in Alameda in case the ransom money is bugged. They make homemade bulletproof vests with scrap metal. Fred rents a trailer in Reno for a safe house and gets a passport under a fake name, Ralph Snyder. In a brazen move, Fred buys a printing calculator to count his inbound windfall of money. Now, half a year later, Ed Ray and 26 children are wondering if they'll die in a cargo trailer buried 12 feet under the earth. Ed and his 26 passengers have been in the dark for 15 hours. They're all half naked, sweating, crying, and exhausted. Fears of death, either by the hands of their attackers or the conditions of their imprisonment, begin to invade Ed's thoughts. Still, Ed, along with 2 older boys, a 14-year-old named Mike Marshall and a 10-year-old named Robert Gonzalez, stack up mattresses with Ed and continue to fight to break free from their subterranean cell. They remove wooden slats from the bed springs on their mattresses and attempt to pry up an opening. They're pushing. They're prying. Eventually, the survival instinct fueling their efforts is rewarded as the overhead steel plates begin to budge. A thin line of blue light shines through. The gap continues to grow with the concerted efforts of Ed and the boys, until finally, an escape is achieved. Meanwhile, back in Chowchilla, the town is alive with an army of volunteers and law enforcement from all over the state taking to the streets searching for clues. Around 8 p.m. on July 16th, Ed Ray, in his underwear, led the children down a dirt road to a nearby grain elevator. A quarry employee was finishing up a welding job and sees the kids in the distance. He pushes an alarm button, assuming it was trespassers. Ed ran to the tower, knowing the news had to have been spread far and wide by now. Ed muttered one sentence to the worker. "We're the ones from Chowchilla." The employee gave Ed some coveralls and got on the phone. Back in Chowchilla, the news was already coming in. By midnight, a crowd of hundreds gathered by the police and fire stations, waiting for Ed and the children to return. Ed and the kids were loaded into a red, white, and blue Greyhound and escorted to the Santa Rosa Correctional Institution, where they were given food and clothing. Around 4 in the morning, the Greyhound pulled into the alley behind the Chowchilla police station. The media swarmed the unloading bus as parents ran to their children. Ed came out last, exhausted and bewildered. He walked out to the cameras. Ed addressed the crowd and the media, describing the horrific ordeal with unwavering stoicism. When asked about the abductors and the efforts to identify and locate them, Ed had but one comment: "I wouldn't let them live if I could get a hold of them." With word of the recovery of Ed and the children, and their scheme completely compromised, Fred, James, and Rick decided it's time to get out of town. The crew met at a nondescript and remote warehouse off I-280 where they stashed their vans. Shortly after grabbing whatever they thought they needed from the warehouse, James and Fred sped off into the night in a 1963 Chrysler toward the safe house trailer in Reno, which now served as the staging point for a final escape to Canada. But Rick went home. He'd already decided to turn himself in. He confessed to his dad, who did what any rich dad would do: set him up with a lawyer, an expensive one. By the 22nd, Frederick Newhall Woods IV was officially a suspect. It was noted that he was arrested, along with the Schoenfelds, back in 1974 for joyriding. The Woods estate was raided, and when reporters asked Fred Woods III about the situation, he remarked, "I can't say if I have one son or 10 sons." By the 23rd, the undelivered ransom note was found. Rife with crossed-out words and misspellings, it read, "Your bus has been kidnapped." It claims they're members of some unknown satanic cabal called Beelzebub, but they don't even spell it right. It mentions Fred by name. It reads like a rough draft for their own use, an afterthought. The vans were found soon after, along with an incredible amount of damning evidence. The search was on for Fred Woods IV and the Schoenfeld brothers. In Chowchilla, Judge Howard Green issued warrants for Fred, James, and Rick and set the bail at $1 million, taking into account the wealthy background of the suspects. The following day, a guilt-racked Rick Schoenfeld, who had spent his time as a fugitive pacing around his parents' house and reading the news, surrendered in Oakland with his dad and lawyer present. A nationwide manhunt was on for James and Fred. Fred and James continued to lay low at their safe house in Reno. Using his phony passport, Fred is able to book a flight to Vancouver, leaving James behind with no good options. Scared and alone, he fled to Idaho, hoping to cross into Canada undetected. On the 18th, James makes an attempt to cross into Canada. He was turned away by Border Patrol due to having several guns in his car. James then drove to Spokane to sell his guns at a sporting goods store. Believing he'd done his due diligence, he tried again to enter Canada at the Cascade border crossing. He was refused, this time because of Fred, who left 2 pistols in the center console and 2 rifles in the trunk, which James had somehow missed when he was specifically looking for guns to get rid of. James then sold the remaining firearms and the van in the '63 Chrysler, trading it for a 1950 Chrysler van. Shortly thereafter, James was apprehended by authorities in Manolo Park, California. Fred, now living under the name Richard Snyder in Vancouver, checked into the St. Francis Hotel on Seymour Street by the freight yards. During his time in Vancouver, Fred wrote a letter to his screenwriter friend David, telling him that his crime would make a good movie of the week, if not a feature. This letter would contribute to his downfall. On Friday, acting on an FBI tip, plainclothes officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police staked out the main Vancouver post office. They knew Fred had been sending letters under the name Richard Snyder. They waited and waited, and eventually, they saw Fred. He walked in, checked his mail, didn't get any, then turned around to leave, walked right into custody. Fred would comment while in custody, "I've got a feeling I won't get a fair trial down there. In a community like that, you would assume that if anybody is suspected of this thing at all, like not proven guilty but suspected, that they just automatically say they're guilty." When informed that his bail was set at $1 million, he remarked the bail seems kinda high. On July 25, 1977, Fred and the Schoenfelds pled guilty on 27 counts of kidnapping for ransom without inflicting bodily injury, reversing their initial pleas. In exchange, the prosecution dropped the 18 counts of armed robbery against them. For the 5 charges of kidnapping with bodily harm, a crime that carried a mandatory sentence of life without parole in California, the 3 pled not guilty. As a result, the case would go to trial. The trial ended on December 15th. The judge sternly stated the children's testimony was plenty. The level of terror they survived constituted bodily harm. This all but ensured that parole was out of the question for all 3 kidnappers, or would have been if it weren't for the high-dollar legal guns hired by the fathers of the crew. Over the years, and with constant legal maneuvering, they all became eligible for parole. The conviction on the bodily harm charges was eventually overturned. Rick Schoenfeld was granted parole and released in 2012. James Schoenfeld was paroled in 2015. As for Fred Woods IV, he was denied parole for the 19th time in 2019. His next parole hearing is scheduled for 2024. If you've enjoyed this tale, please feel free to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more.